So again, thank you, Cam, for being on here. I'm Discerning Elephant. I'm super excited to talk about lymphedema and just the process that you went through, the ebbs and flows, and truly what people really need to know, specifically kids. Because I'm a former educator, and I really want to know how I can show kids, particularly like from 5 years old to 17, how they can get through this. And my goal is to take this footage that you're going to give me, take it into the public education domain, so they kind of look to you for like strength, and especially the athletes. So we typically work with young men of color, young boys of color, and they always feel defeated. And kind of just hearing your story is something I think is noteworthy, and people should hear. So,
awesome. Yeah. Yes.
You want to tell us a little bit about you?
Yes, I will. I guess start from as far back of the beginning as I can. So my name is Cam. I am 32 years young now. I live in Houston, Texas, and professionally, I'm a compression therapy consultant. Basically, I work for a company called Lymphapress, which is one of the lymphedema pump manufacturers. So part of my job is it's kind of part medical device sales. So I go into all of the major hospital systems and outpatient rehab facilities in the greater Houston area. But I also get to educate surgeons, physicians, lymphedema therapists, and then ultimately lymphedema patients on different compression modalities, such as the pump. So I've been personally dealing with my lymphedema for over 20 years now. I was actually originally diagnosed at age 11. So it was that summer of, I believe, 5th grade going into 6th grade. So I hadn't quite started junior high yet. And at that 5th grade time period, 11 for most young boys, that's kind of that age where a lot of us start really going through that first growth spurt, puberty, and those hormonal changes. That's just, so much fun to look back on. But for me personally, I've always been relatively tall for my age. Currently, I'm 6'4". So I get some height from my family. So at that age 11, I was really rapidly growing leading up to that summer. And I just remember playing YMCA basketball. So right before, you got to that super competitive age of playing sports. But even at YMCA basketball, we were always really, really competitive and always wanted to be undefeated. That was like always our goal every year. And I recall looking back at that age of what kind of started my whole lymphedema journey. And it was really after most of those games toward the end of the season, a lot of the parents would come up to my parents, and my dad was one of the coaches of the team. And a lot of the comments I was getting from these parents was, hey, is Cam okay? It looks like he's kind of limping up and down the court. Did he hurt himself? And I had a little bit of lower back pain after most of those games. But again, myself and my parents included, it's like, that's just part of the game. You're going to be sore. You're not super flexible and your body's growing right now. But enough parents had raised concern that it led my parents to say, okay, well, let's just go to an orthopedic doctor, just, to make sure everything's okay. Mm-hmm. And when they immediately did x-rays, the first thing that they noticed was that my right leg was about 1.5 inches shorter than my left. So that would explain why I was having the lower back pain and why it looked like I was limping up and down the court, because that difference in length, that's basically equivalent to like wearing one shoe and being barefoot. So if you think just running up and down the basketball court, though it may have looked like I was really hustling and trying and almost galloping, it is because there was a leg length discrepancy. And the other thing that the orthopedic doctor noticed in that initial x-ray imaging was, he said, there's some weird spotting on your right distal femur, so essentially your right knee. And he even went as far as said, it looks like it could be bone cancer. So really, without even having thorough imaging or other diagnostic types of, protocols, this physician, this orthopedic doctor, really scared the bejesus out of my parents, and obviously myself included, because at age 11, when you're told you think you may have cancer, like that's the big C word. Because when you're young, you don't really know much about chronic diseases and sicknesses, but when you hear cancer, at that time I had either a close friend's mother who had just died of breast cancer. And, I had other family members that had passed too from different types of cancer. You really start kind of spiraling out of control mentally and psychologically. And really the only way that they wanted to go in and basically rule out that it wasn't cancer was to do a bone biopsy surgery. So it's, relatively minimally invasive. So not a major surgery, but the surgeon went in and removed, I'll kind of show you, about a pinky's width of bone from my right knee. And that post-op experience was pretty difficult because about 2 weeks after the surgery, and that's typically enough time for most patients and really any type of orthopedic surgery, whether it's an ACL tear or even total knee replacements for a lot of patients, by 2 weeks post-op, you should have a pretty decent amount of physical therapy done and almost regain a decent range of motion. But the thing that was really odd about my case is about 2 weeks post-op, even doing physical therapy, 3 times a week, what I was noticing was my right leg just continued to like double, triple, and 1 point almost quadruple in size of my left. And it was really painful. And I was really confused because a lot of these physical therapists were just saying, hey, that's normal part of post-op. You're going to have a little bit of swelling and your leg is going to start to get stronger again. But for the life of me, myself, and obviously my parents included, could not understand why this right leg, specifically kind of my upper thigh, was so swollen. And I couldn't even really put any weight on my right leg. And so basically it took me over a year from that point in time of having that initial swelling to go from different specialty clinic, different physicians, really kind of pushed around the system to get the proper diagnosis of primary lymphedema. And the crazy part about that is that, I live in Houston, Texas, which, I mean, if you're not super aware with Houston has the largest medical center in the United States. So it's not like I'm living in a small rural area or even a small like major city where there's just not a lot of specialties. It's like, no, I'm being seen by the top doctors. And even still in the year 2001, it took me about a year to finally get diagnosed with lymphedema. So fortunately now the medical community has come quite a bit ways in not only recognizing and diagnosing lymphedema, but offering treatment protocols for patients. I wouldn't say cures because there's not any widespread cure for lymphedema yet, unfortunately. So
did we not have the terminology to know what that was in 2002? Like,
oh no, we definitely did. The lymphedema was at that point, it was already well established. There was a diagnostic code. So even for like insurance, for example, you could have that code, that lymphedema diagnosis code, to where it would make me, depending upon patient's insurance, that's a whole nother thing we can talk about, but that made me eligible to receive proper lymphedema treatments, which for a lot of patients, it's seeing a certified lymphedema therapist, right? And these aren't physicians typically, but they're most of the case either a physical therapist or occupational therapist who went and got his or her certification specifically in treating the management of lymphedema. So that looks like a number of different things. Oftentimes it's doing what's called manual lymphatic drainage. So it's basically just a light massage on the arm or the leg or really wherever the patient's afflicted with their lymphedema. And then it oftentimes involves bandaging for a course of about 4 weeks to really get, leg or arm or again, wherever the patient swells down to a manageable size. And then at that point, the therapist kind of graduates you, if you will, to manage it all on your own. So when we talk about pediatric patients, that's my biggest passion for serving because, that's where I can relate to the most because I was a pediatric patient. It can be very difficult for a number of different reasons. The first one is regardless of the patient's socioeconomic background, like they could come from a wealthy class, they can come from middle class like I did, or they can come from, lower socioeconomic class where they may not have both parents, for example. Despite the socioeconomic breakdown for these pediatric patients, the most difficult part about managing lymphedema is that it requires daily discipline, right? So this is something you have to incorporate in your day-to-day life. And by that, I mean, it means things like wearing your compression stockings. And these aren't just like putting on a knee brace, right? Like oftentimes, like for example, the patient is affecting the legs, they have to wear medical grade compression garments that really help make sure that the leg does not swell really bad throughout the day. And these can be really difficult to put on for certain patients and uncomfortable to wear. And really, especially depending upon where the patient lives, like me living in Texas, especially during the summertime when it's literally over 100 degrees, like a lot of patients don't want to wear them because they're not super comfortable. And I'm constantly reminding patients, whether they're 2 years old or 92 years old, that lymphedema and gravity do not take any days off. So days in which you choose not to wear your compression garments, days in which you choose not to use your compression pump, for example, those are all things that you're going to have to work harder to make up on the back end, right? So picture it almost like one of those sand hourglasses that you tip over, right? And all that sand starts to fill on the bottom part of the bowl. Well, that's what happens for our lymphatic system when you don't compress. It's just literally almost a ticking time bomb that your arms or legs, or again, wherever you're afflicted with your lymphedema, it is a progressive condition. So it will get worse if you do not manage it. So that can be pretty overwhelming for really any patient, you know, whether you're a full-grown adult or especially pediatrics. And one thing too that a lot of pediatric patients will get, and even adult patients, is they'll get this like long laundry list of certain activities, for example, that you should avoid, like bug bites or scraping your knees, or really any of those kind of basic things that as a student athlete, they're pretty much unavoidable, right? You can't tell a young boy or even a young girl athlete, hey, you know, don't skin your knee, right? Because if you're playing sports like I did, basketball, and I was actually a 3-sport athlete. I played baseball, basketball, and football growing up, but I mostly focused on basketball. That's a very much a contact sport where, you know, breaking bones and, you know, all sorts of other injuries are almost unavoidable, especially if you really kind of give your heart and soul into the game. So how do you then find that balance as a child to be conscientious of your condition that you're told there's no cure for, that it is progressive? And then how do you combine that with this desire to be normal, just like all of your buddies and your teammates and your peers, of wanting to play at a high level? Like I had dreams in 6th grade, like I'm going to make it to the NBA, right? Like that was like a goal, a dream of mine. And even at a young age, I knew that the odds were stacked against me. I knew that it's very, very, very competitive and not very likely, even if I was the best in my neighborhood or the best in my city, right? So I then took kind of baby steps, like, okay, well, then I want to play varsity basketball in high school. And after that, I want to play collegiate and kind of go from there. But when you're told in 6th grade, so really right even before you're at that super competitive level, that you're probably never going to even be able to play high school basketball because your lymphedema is just going to really kind of get in the way of that. At that point in time, I really felt like I became a man at age 11, because at that point in time, I had to make that conscious decision of, am I going to be super compliant and do all the things that my lymphedema therapist says to manage this condition? Or am I just going to kind of throw my hands and give up and say, okay, this is the hand that God dealt me, and it's going to get worse. I better just embrace that and just not really care about managing the condition and just, you know, collect my disability check from the government every month, right? So I chose this path. I chose this fork in the road of working my tail off, and it really did instill in me a undaunted work ethic at a very young age, that I knew if I wanted to even just compete, let alone excel in any sport or really any physical activity I was going to do that point moving forward, that it was going to require discipline of me wearing my garments and doing my pump and avoiding certain food types and really doing all of those things that I know was going to give me a fighting chance at some normalcy. So that is high level me as a pediatric patient and kind of navigating those waters of that. And I will say too, to lend some motivation to those younger patients who may have lymphedema or really any other similar condition or disability where the cards are kind of stacked against you. Don't give up. I know that's very cliche, but really there's a motivational TED talk I saw from Ray Lewis, who's a famous former NFL linebacker. And his whole thing is there's two sides of pain. There's the physical side where we feel it and we want to give up and quit and kind of give into that side. And then the other side of pain is glory. And that's when you triumph over that pain. And I've experienced that. I've experienced that side of pain, the glory side, tenfold by overachieving, proving my own self-doubt wrong, proving all my high school coaches wrong, proving all those doctors wrong. And I was able to play NCAA basketball my freshman year with my lymphedema. So that's something I'm very proud about. Now, did I get a lot of playing time? No. Was the physical demands of the game at that level a little bit too intense for my lymphedema? Yes. But I can now say that I did play NCAA basketball and I got to check off that box of my dream. So I just try to tell patients, again, regardless of your disability or, specifically if you have lymphedema, do all those things that those doctors tell you and then some. If they're going to try to say you can't do certain things, push through it and then go back to them and say, well, watch me, look what I did.
I thank you for that. I do want to know, is lymphedema, is it hereditary? Like, how did it, is there anyone in your family with a history of it? Like, some people probably wonder, like, how someone's athletic, already goal driven to be athletic and, a professional. How did this happen?
So that's a great question. So high level for everybody, there's actually two types of lymphedema. So the first one is that primary, that hereditary. So you are born with it. It's a genetic malformation, right? And I'll go in more detail about that. And then the second type of lymphedema is secondary. And the reason it's called secondary is because it's secondary to oftentimes some type of trauma. So just for a quick example that most people can relate to or maybe have a loved one. So picture a breast cancer patient, for example, when they're going through perhaps chemo, radiation, or even the surgical intervention where you may have heard, oh, they removed 22 lymph nodes under my arm, or they did a mastectomy where they removed the breast, right? It's after that trauma, after that surgical intervention, that a patient can then establish lymphedema because their lymphatic system is impaired because of some sort of, it could even be as basic as a car accident or another orthopedic surgery gone wrong where those lymphatic system was impaired. Therefore, you then develop lymphedema secondary to something else. Okay, so that's secondary. So back to your initial question about, okay, Campbell, why you? How you? On paper, you look pretty healthy. No other comorbidities or other pre-existing conditions. So what we now know, due to advancements in lymphatic imaging and just other research that's been done, there is really a direct correlation in our vascular system, so our veins, and our lymphatic system. In fact, from the anatomy perspective, they just kind of run a lymph vessel and a vein kind of run parallel. And a lymph vessel is actually much smaller than a vein. Like a lymph vessel is actually even smaller than a hair follicle. So like picture your hair, how fine that is. A lymph vessel is even smaller than that. So we're talking microscopic, right underneath the surface of your skin. So for a primary lymphedema patient, essentially that means he or she is born with some sort of impaired lymphatics, right? It could have been the stress of the birth itself, or they could have inherited those genetic markers from their parents. So for me personally, growing up, like even up to that age 11 where I was initially diagnosed, we'd never heard the word lymphedema. It wasn't something that was medical or social vernacular to us. We never, like I said, and this is before Google image search, right? The internet was still very much in its infancy. Like you couldn't do all the things that we can do now, which part of it's a good thing, but part of it can be a bad thing for misinformation. But again, I didn't have any aunts, uncles, grandparents, or obviously my biological parents who are still part of my life. They didn't have lymphedema, to my knowledge. But what we now know with research is basically when we are in our embryonic phase. So this is like going into like 7 weeks of development before we're even born. we now know that the vascular system and the lymphatic system are basically developing and mutating at the exact same time in parallel. So basically, if a patient has a family history of any type of venous disease, right? Not even lymphedema, so it could be like varicose veins, spider veins, or you may have grandparents or parents that just have always had swollen legs, maybe because of their diabetes, for example, right? They could have secondary lymphedema, right? So if a patient's parents and their family tree has any type of vascular malformation, they're basically can be at risk for establishing lymphedema. And that's what happened to me. My dad and his mother have a family history of chronic venous insufficiency. So that's just a fancy word for saying that over time, their veins wear out a little bit faster. So their veins have valves in it, so it can't move that vascular fluid. Therefore, it spills into the lymphatic system, then their legs swell. So I inherited essentially those genetic markers from my dad's side. And for me, it just happened faster. My sister decided that, hey, you're going to have lymphedema, and your triggering event, which for me was going through puberty. And puberty is typically a sign where a lot of pediatric patients who have primary lymphedema, that's when they'll start to swell because their body's going through a lot. It's changing, and that lymph fluid cannot drain. So, and there can even be pediatric lymphedema for newborns where that's prevalent, like right out of the womb, right? Those cases are a little bit more rare. But in most primary lymphedema, so hereditary lymphedema patients like myself, it takes some sort of triggering event to make them symptomatic. So you can actually see the swelling arms, legs, or wherever they're afflicted. So for me, it was that surgery that I had that really started to kickstart my lymphedema symptoms. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. I'm actually really shocked because it's funny now I think about like my grandma and some of my aunts. They always had like swollen arms or legs or feet or ankles, particularly. They are all ankles all the time. Like, oh, go outside and stretch and let the get some sit under some hot sun, and you will sweat it out. Is there any correlation with the sun and lymphedema? Like, you think about
absolutely
all the sweating out.
So I tell patients, my lymphedema patients, that there's a seasonality to lymphedema, right? So, I was talking earlier, I live in Houston, Texas, which is a very hot and humid city for the most part of the year. So patients with lymphedema specifically will typically swell more in those hotter months out of the year. And like even you, for example, if you don't have lymphedema, you may have, rings or jewelry that during that heat of the summer, it's kind of hard to take this ring off, versus in the wintertime, it's like, it just slips right off, right? So our bodies naturally, even if you don't have lymphedema, tend to be a little bit more inflamed during those hotter months or in that hotter climate. So lymphedema patients who do live in those hotter cities may really experience a more advanced swelling in their extremities during those hotter months. And that weeping that you talked about, oftentimes that's not sweat. That can be what's called lymphuria, which basically is just a fancy term for that lymphatic fluid that seeps out of the skin. And it can have kind of a foul odor to it at times, if it's kind of a milky color, which can be kind of traumatizing and embarrassing for a lot of lymphedema patients. And it makes wearing certain clothes difficult, because if you're wearing just like regular jeans or sweatpants and your legs or arms start weeping lymphatic fluid, that weeping can last quite a bit. And next thing you know, there's a puddle at your foot and you're like, what the heck is this? This isn't regular perspiration. So there are patients, lymphedema patients, who can experience that advanced swelling, especially in hotter climates.
Is there an indicator, like for example, for yourself, is there times when like, okay, this is, I can feel it coming on, like I can feel like I know I'm going to be, perspiring, and it's not going to be for me the fluid and not necessarily sweat? Like, can you feel it?
Yeah. Every patient's a little bit different in terms of like how their bodies move lymphatic fluid, or if they have those episodes. Because I've had episodes, I even remember in that 7th grade period when my lymphedema started to get a little bit more advanced, where I would have some of that weeping out of my inner thigh. And for me, what kind of would make those episodes exacerbate would be like if I was playing basketball all day with like my buddies in my driveway at my house and I wasn't wearing my compression garment. So not only was my leg getting a lot of movement and inflammation that was not being properly contained by my compression garments, which I should have been more compliant about wearing, but you also throw in that summer heat in Houston, that I would be kind of feeling lightheaded. So those were some of the symptoms that I felt, that I knew it just wasn't regular perspiration, because I for the most part did a good job of staying hydrated when we're out there. I'm drinking Gatorade, drinking plenty of water. And then when I would be resting in between games, I would be kind of cooling off in my garage, and then I would just look at my mid thigh and I would see almost kind of that kind of milky clear fluid draining from my inner thigh. I'm like, oh crap, this is obviously not sweat. So those were some of my symptoms that I would experience, as I would have those episodes of the weeping leg from the lymphedema.
Did you ever have, and with all due, I want to respect your, masculine.
Sure, yeah, open book.
Okay. Did you ever have like a real like breakdown, like to the point where you like felt like inner depression? I'm just like, just bawling of like, what does this mean? Like,
I have had and continue to have those moments, right? And I think the older I get, when I'll take a step back and kind of explain my breakdowns when I was younger in my adolescence, and then my breakdowns as a young adult, and then my breakdowns currently now as a, I guess, full-grown man child, if you will. So when I was in 6th grade, I think my first emotional breakdown was, again, hearing the word cancer, even though the biopsy proved that it wasn't cancer. I think just hearing that I have or could have a disease that could either lead to my premature death or limit me physically from being a normal boy, being a normal student athlete. That initial shock in 6th grade is what really kind of made me spiral into, honestly, a state of depression, because as I was recovering from that initial surgery, I had missed about a week and a half of school, which that can be a pretty substantial amount of time when you're going into 6th grade and you're getting into a little bit more advanced classes like pre-algebra, for example. You miss a week and a half in that, like your ability, if you're not really strong in math, like you're going to be forever playing catch up. And that's what happened to me. And that's like still to this day, it's kind of stigmatized me. I am terrible at math. And I honestly think part of it roots back to me missing that amount of school at a young age from that initial surgery and not being able to cognitively and mentally catch up to my peers in math. Now, reading and writing and the creative side has never been an issue for me. I even did theater growing up. So I've always been very expressive. And I think that's one thing good, is I was very vocal and expressive of the pain I'm going through. And I know not all patients are going to be an extrovert like me, but even if you're an introvert, find someone, whether it's a parent, a sibling, a friend, a cousin, that you can be your true, vulnerable, honest self to. Because if you let it bottle up inside, it's only going to come this grenade that you just explode in the long run. So in having breakdowns, they're okay. They're healthy. I mean, I've had nights I've cried my eyes out, kind of having that pity party. But the older I get, and with some of the opportunities I have to work with patients who have way worse lymphedema than I ever had and ever will have, is humbling and it's touching. And it also gives me, give yourself some grace, Cam. Give yourself a pat on the back. You've accomplished more than a lot of your peers that don't have any disability, don't have any cards or adversity stacked against them. You have persevered. You are strong. You are a warrior. And I think having those positive affirmations, even at a young age, that came from my family, came from my friends, but ultimately came from myself, from within. I think that's the strongest one, is from yourself and from within. Because when you believe that and you can tell yourself that, that's when you can persevere against yourself. Because oftentimes it's the self-doubt that comes in when you hear external forces, when you hear coaches tell you, oh, Cam, you're never going to play varsity basketball. Oh, Cam, you're never going to play collegiate basketball. And then when you get some of the teasing and taunting that you may get from your peers or from teammates or from the opposing team, like I constantly did. When I wore my compression garments in the games, this was before Nike and Under Armour and all these other big sports brands made compression sleeves cool, made it a normal thing. So, for example, when I'd be at the free throw line playing basketball, the opposing team would chant pantyhose, pantyhose. Like, they didn't know that I had a medical condition. So I used those naysayers as kind of my fuel to my fire to prove them wrong. And fast forward to being a young adult, and having some of those breakdowns, it would be me thinking, okay, beyond playing sports, because my athletic career, that's beyond me now. Now I'm in a professional role of working. I worked in advertising for a bit. How do I socially accept my lymphedema? I know that I'm going to have physical limitations. I love music and love going to concerts and music festivals, for example. And I know that if I stand for long periods of time, even with my compression garments on, that's really going to cause a flare up of my lymphedema. So how am I going to either muscle through those and have an enjoyable experience? Or when am I going to raise my hand and say, you know what, I need special handicap accommodations? I may not look handicapped on the surface to most people, but I bottom line, I have a disability. So how do I come to peace with that and accept that and embrace that? I've had several breakdowns about that, and ultimately several breakdowns about how am I going to be attractive, physically attractive to the opposite sex? How am I going to find a female that is going to not only accept my lymphedema, but embrace it as well and be there for me, be a caretaker? Right now, for example, I'm laid up in bed, and thank goodness I have my parents here in Houston that they're able to take care of me after this major surgery I just endured. Because I've lost girlfriends from past serious relationships in my early to mid to late 20s, because I had episodes of infections with my lymphedema that required surgery. That it goes from, okay, Cam being this fun loving boyfriend who can go to the clubs and dance with me and, you know, be the life of the party and go on hikes with me, go on vacations with me, to now, okay, he's laid up in the hospital and he's going to have at least a month or two of having to learn how to walk again. How do I be his caretaker now? That can be a lot for a lot of young women and young men who are dating someone where it's fresh. So I've lost a lot of serious relationships because of my lymphedema, and that played a major role in me psychologically, and had breakdowns because of that. And me, in my now early 30s, I'm 32 now, but on my 30th year, I was on The Bachelorette and Bachelor in Paradise. That is the ultimate dating experience, because not only are you sharing a girlfriend, so to speak, but you're doing this in front of millions and millions of viewers, and you're putting yourself out there. And if you're not an a-hole like a lot of my castmates were, you're being true, you're being authentic, you're being your real self. And I was actually penalized for that. And unfortunately, I had a really bad edit from these producers in the network that kind of personified me as a villain and did not tell an accurate narrative about my lymphedema and the struggles I had been through. They kind of twisted that narrative and made it sound like I was manipulating my way and trying to get pity for this girl to feel sorry for me. So as an adult, that had a psychological impact on me, dealing with just the backlash that I've gotten from complete strangers on social media. I mean, at one point I had over 50,000 followers on my Instagram, for example, and I was getting daily direct messages, things like death threats and things just really degrading my character based on who they thought I was from a stupid reality TV show. So even as a grown adult, I've had struggles with that. But now I think finding more peace, again, that self-positive affirmation. I am a Christian, I am a believer. So having my religious, foundations has kind of centered me, and has made me think, okay, God is not going to put me through anything that he knows I'm not strong enough to get through with him. And though I've had some pretty major surgeries this past December and this past March, and we'll have one more additional major surgery this upcoming May, I'm now in a much more positive headspace. And there's still moments where I'm a human being, I'm like, well, what if this goes wrong? You know, what happens in that scenario? But I try to quickly get out of that headspace and remind myself how blessed I am to not only have a platform where I can inspire other patients, but ultimately be in this community, this lymphedema community that has grown so much year over year and has unconditionally supported me since I have been an advocate, since I've come out, if you will, with my lymphedema about a year and a half ago.
It's crazy, because when you were speaking, first of all, I'm incredibly touched. First of all, not only did you talk about your vulnerabilities, but you also talk about your faith, which is so beautiful. And the fact about the actual fact that you are human and that you're not separating yourself from having the diagnosis and then still wanting love, which is something we all want. And the fact that you still said, I'm still this person, but I'm detached. you're like basically like putting yourself out there. And basically, even still, you realize that, granted, it was on a TV show, that they did that disservice to you and took that edit out. And it's just like, did she not know? Did she not know? Or did you tell her? I mean,
so I had, just
I'm
to give
curious
you
about
some
that.
quick background,
Yeah.
I had a very honest and transparent conversation with Hannah Brown, who is my lead. She was the Bachelorette on my season of The Bachelorette 2 seasons ago. I had a very open and honest conversation with her about my lymphedema, and I made it perfectly clear as the conversation started. I said, look, first and foremost, I do not want you to feel sorry for me for what I'm about to tell you. I know, Hannah, that if it's going to be you and me who survive this journey, and theoretically at the end of this, when the cameras aren't rolling and it's no longer reality TV and it is reality, when it is real life, and we are hypothetically at the altar exchanging wedding vows, there's something in those wedding vows that's very important to me. And it's that line, in sickness and in health. I'm someone who has had a history of sickness that has impacted my past relationships. So I even told her a little bit in detail how I have lost past serious girlfriends because they couldn't handle those moments of my weakness when I needed a caretaker, right? So I said, look, again, I don't want you to feel sorry for me, but I also want you to know I am a strong man, and my strength is different than some of these other guys who are 23 years old and have six-pack abs and do CrossFit all day, every day. Like, they can have their superficial strength. And I'm not knocking people who want to be really healthy. I think it's great. But like, when that's all that they are, that like, just you look on their Instagram, it's just, you know, topless pictures of them flexing, like, that's not me. That never was me and never will be me. So I said, look, my strength is that I am a fighter, and I fight for myself, and I fight for the ones that I love, and I fight for love. And so I said, with that said, here is me kind of putting all my cards on the table. Here is my lymphedema, what it has done to me, but how I have persevered. And so I said, look, I know that there's future dates in this journey that could involve pretty serious athletic competition, and I would feel much better letting you know now ahead of the game than me potentially being on one of those date activities where the guys are, like, for example, they played rugby in Ireland in my season. That happened an episode after I got eliminated, but I would have felt more calculated and manipulated had I been invited to that date, and I would have had to pull her aside. Hey, by the way, I can't compete in this activity because of my lymphedema. So I wanted to be as transparent and honest and upfront as possible. So she kind of knew, not something that defines me, but something that's a big part of my life. You know, I was saying earlier, lymphedema is a condition that requires daily management. So she actually received it very well. And I was actually really, pleased with how the conversation went. However, 45 minutes later, she had a conversation with another man in the mansion. And I don't know if it was producer manipulated, but somehow he basically told Hannah that the reason why I was basically making up this medical sob story was so that I could get a pity rose and stick around because I thought I was going to be eliminated. So at that point in time, she had already, I guess, had a stronger relationship with that guy. So it was really like he said versus he said type of scenario. And so she pulled me back over. I'll never forget. She had this like angry look on her face when she approached me and said, Cam, we need to talk. And you know that word, the so-and-so, we need to talk. Rarely is it ever a good thing. You don't want to hear that. And so she pulled me back aside to the same spot where we had our conversation prior. And she said, Cam, though I appreciate you being open and, transparent about your condition, I just have to question the timing of it. It just feels a little slimy and greasy and, basically making me have to then be put on the spot with cameras on me, with the microphone. And I was already scared to death the day before even having this conversation, because this means that now millions of people would know about something I've been very self-conscious about. So it took a lot of bravery for me to even have that conversation, knowing that it would air several weeks later for millions of people. So now, for the first time in my entire life, I'm being put on the spotlight and I'm having to defend myself for having a disability, for having a condition. And I shut down, and I immediately became unattracted to her as a person, that I don't ever want to be with someone who's going to make me feel guilty for having lymphedema and make me explain myself, why I told her about it, when I told her about it. So unfortunately that night I got eliminated from the journey. And then beyond that, 3 weeks later, once that episode airs, at that point leading up to that episode, it was episode 3, I was already kind of getting a villainous edit. They were taking things I was saying out of context and just kind of splicing sound bits here and there. I'm like, okay, I can kind of see where this is going to go. In the episode that aired, they edited out me talking about my lymphedema. They didn't even mention the word lymphedema. So not only did the viewers not have that context of my story, but the way they edited it and spliced it, it was serving to the narrative of the other guy in the house that, yeah, Cam is making up the story. So at that point, the millions of Americans who think that reality TV is exactly as it appears on the screen, those are the people that were sending me death threats. Those are the people that were saying things that you're creepy, you're never going to be worthy of a woman. I had people like Jimmy Kimmel and David Spade and other A-list celebrities who have talk shows that do recaps of the shows just really degrade me and emasculate me. And I had to deal with that. I had to deal with that for a year and a half. And honestly, that gave me some PTSD from the whole journey. And I always tell patients, PTSD is not just from combat veterans. It's any type of trauma. Anybody can experience trauma and have post-traumatic stress disorder from those traumas. So I've gotten better about dealing with it. And, you know, they still come here and there just because some people are late to the series and to the show. But now my platform, if anyone looks at my Instagram, they're going to see me talking about lymphedema. They're going to see me sharing my triumphs, my patients' triumphs, and trying again to be a voice for this community. And in the United States alone, over 20 million people have lymphedema. And that is more than most major mainstream conditions like AIDS, MLS, and Parkinson's combined, right? There's a higher lymphedema patient population. But the issue is that there's not a lot of lymphedema therapists. There's not a lot of doctors that are treating and managing lymphedema, and there's not a cure for it currently. So it's a challenge for patients. And I just try to be that beacon of hope and say, look, you have lymphedema, but lymphedema doesn't have to have you. You can still persevere against it and live a very fulfilling life. I mean, I played NCAA basketball. I got to be on a reality TV show. I've got to travel the world. I get to speak at Harvard Medical School, giving TED Talks, like not bragging and all, but I'm just trying to show lymphedema patients you can still live a very fulfilling life, even with a disability that tries to control you.
What I love is that you were able to create purpose in your life. You took an infirmity and literally switch it around and use it for your good, to the point where the people who actually see it, and when you're human in this world, you actually recognize that this world is built on so much false pretense, and we get lost in imagery and what we think life should be. And really, what life really is about is love. It's about compassion. It's about really choosing love and to be good stewards of life to show people that, you know, we are one of the same. And it's so funny that I always thought to myself that it is the stuff that divides us with infirmities, injustices, you know, economics, that it doesn't matter to anyone until it happens to them or until it happens to someone close to them. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, I probably shouldn't have said that. Oh wait, I probably shouldn't have been a racist. Or I probably shouldn't have been a sexist until it happens to them. And the fact that you're taking this on, and you are an ambassador, and not literally entitled, literally on the front line, sharing your story. And unfortunately, what started off bad on a reality show, and all of a sudden now, you're exactly where I think God really wants you to be. And I'm so proud to see that evolution in what you're doing. And I'm so sorry that we live in a world that we live in that's there's not necessarily, I wouldn't even say forgiven, but it really just doesn't care until the whole world cares.
Yes.
It's like we always have to get this buy-in in order to be made something for people to actually protect. And so, you know what, you probably shouldn't say that. It's sad, but it's kind of like this consensus building for either for the good or for the bad. It really sucks.
And thank you so much for those kind words. And the sad reality, especially here in the United States, is that healthcare is a $1 trillion industry. It's a business, right? And it's a business of either helping patients or not. And unfortunately, lymphedema is so far on the totem pole for these physicians and these research facilities to actually care. It's so sad because patients are suffering every single day. And so it is my job working with nonprofits like LEARN, which stands for Lymphatic Education Research Network, and some of the other ones that even like Bryland's Feet Foundation that helps pediatric lymphedema patients. It's those grassroots, again, lymphedema warriors out there that are fighting every day, not only for awareness, but to actually evoke change, for insurance companies to give Medicare patients, to give other insurance policies better coverage for things that are necessary for lymphedema patients to manage the condition, for the medical school curriculums to actually talk about the lymphatic system, not even lymphedema. That's another sad reality, is in most 4 years of medical school, med students only get about 30 minutes to an hour of education on the lymphatic system, right? That's less than like STDs and all these other things that they learn in the course of 4 years. You're only getting 30 minutes up to an hour. So how are you, as a young physician, coming out of medical school, how are you going to be able to be in a clinic and even recognize what lymphedema is if you never even heard about it? So I used to be mad at these doctors, but I understand now, like popping open the hood and seeing what's really going on behind the scenes. They don't know because they were never taught. So that's another big thing, is increasing the education. And I even think that in junior high and high school biology classes, when we're talking about the human anatomy, there needs to be more mentioning about the lymphatic system, because it is such a pivotal role, because the lymphatic system literally touches every organ in our body from head to toe. We have lymphatic fluid in our brains, right, that influences some patients for establishing dementia or Alzheimer's. We're starting to see the research on that. So this is like something that it's going to be a life mission for me, to really help push the envelope and get in front of the legislation and have them care. Have them know that lymphedema patients' lives do matter, and there are better ways, but the only way they're going to do that is when we have systemic change.
I completely agree with you. I want to ask specifically, you mentioned that you had to have a couple of surgeries,
yes,
like all in a matter of like 4 months, and I think you're going into your third one. What surgeries are you having? Because I thought once you get lymphedema, it's more of the swelling, you just compress it and use the machine. What actual surgeries are you doing?
So a couple of things. So now one of the good advancements that we have, and these surgeries, these lymphedema specific surgeries have been around for over 20 years, mostly in Europe and Asian countries. So we're starting to see more advancements here in the United States. But basically, in July of last year, I had my first lymphedema related surgery, and I had that at the Cleveland Clinic up in Ohio. And essentially, there's a couple of different lymphedema surgeries that are available. One is kind of more of a debulking. So patients who have really large extremities, it's almost like a liposuction, where they're getting all of that extra fluid. And if there's lymphatic mass and fatty tissue involved, they'll get the volume down. And then they'll still require a patient to wear compression, but it just kind of helps, get that big mass essentially off of their arm or legs or wherever they're affected. And then there's other lymphedema surgeries where it involves, again, attaching a lymph vessel. So again, that's smaller than a hair follicle, doing an anastomosis, which is basically a fancy word for an attachment. So basically attaching lymph vessels to a parallel vein so it can help pump, because our veins and our lymph vessels pump the same way, kind of a similar anatomy. So that's super micro surgery. So there's not many surgeons in the US who are doing that. You have to go to these specialty clinics. So that's what I had done in July of last year, was a lymphovenous anastomosis. So that's, again, just kind of a fancy word for saying they attach some of my lymph vessels to healthy veins to improve that lymphatic flow. And it's worked really well for me. But the surgery that I had in December of last year was due to an infection. And one thing that a lot of lymphedema patients can experience is bouts of infection. The most common one is cellulitis, which is essentially the skin infection that, if caught early on, you just take some antibiotics, either through an IV or orally, depending upon how early you catch it. But several bouts of cellulitis can do permanent damage to your lymphatic system and can be lethal if, it goes unattended. But I've never had a bout of cellulitis. When I've had these bouts of infection, I always thought that's what it was, just because that's what the textbooks say. But it turns out I have what's called osteomyelitis, which basically means chronic infection of the bone, osteo. So the surgery that I had in December was because I had a flare up where I had literally microbacteria of infection getting into that bone and eating away the bone. It is excruciatingly painful. And the first symptoms I know when I'm having an episode is increased swelling in that extremity, sore throat, and just this very, very specific pain. And it's also followed by high fever. So unfortunately, I've had 7 bouts of those infections over the past 4 years. So that's led to over 8 surgeries. So the surgery that I had most recently in March was basically, it was basically a total knee replacement surgery, and those are pretty common. But instead of doing the actual prosthetic knee joint to be fully functional, this is part 1 where they basically put a cement block in there. It's basically a cement spacer. So I have no knee joint right now. It's just this temporary cement block that dissolves antibiotics. So right now I even have an IV in. You can't really see it. It's covered with my cover here, but I have to do multiple IV antibiotic infusions for the course of 7 weeks. So basically what they're doing is they're basically treating my knee like I had a cancerous tumor, completely remove the joint, and they're zapping all the surrounding areas with really strong antibiotics to make sure that come May 20th, which is my upcoming surgery, where they are doing the regular total knee replacement, that I won't have any issues of infection of that bone. Because if you have an infection when you have hardware in your leg, that can be pretty serious.
So my question to you next is, you mentioned triggers. So when you said 7 bouts. So does that mean, like, for example, like how does, like, do they just come out of nowhere? Like, for example, like if you're annoyed,
Yes.
if you eat something, if like, what brings those about?
You know, I have spent hours and hours trying to identify those common denominators, those things that were in common when I had one of these triggers. And not really a whole lot. I mean, they're so sporadic and spontaneous. They've happened in cold months. They've happened in warm months. They've happened with girlfriends, without girlfriends, right? But I think one of the main things is stress in my life. Because when you're stressed, your immune system's automatically impacted. And because your lymphatic system plays a pivotal role in your immune system, I didn't have these bouts of infection because of my lymphedema. It's because of the osteomyelitis. That's already kind of a separate condition in itself. But the lymphedema is more so an enabler, right? It definitely was not helping because these episodes have been isolated in my knee, and that's where most of my swelling occurs too. So it's kind of like the perfect storm. The lymphedema allows these infections to thrive when they do occur. So again, stress would be one of the common triggers. Emotional stress too. So it was crazy because back in 2016, a week after one of my grandmothers had passed, my mom's mom, who I was very close to, that kind of emotional trauma and the stress of moving back to Texas from California. I lived in LA for a couple of years for work. So all of that kind of put my body on shutdown, and I had a flare up and I had an episode of infection. And then fast forward 2 years later, I'm dating a different girl, and I get a call at 10 o'clock at night from my father telling me that his mom had passed away. And I wasn't as close with that grandma, but I was having some issues with my girlfriend at the time, just kind of, determining where we're going, the next step in the relationship. And then all of a sudden I get this bomb dropped on me that my other grandma had passed away. And 3 hours later, I woke up at 1 or 2 in the morning with that very specific excruciating pain. I called my parents and said, I'm going to the ER right now. I'm having another episode. So I wouldn't say it's just necessarily death in the family. I think that was more of a coincidence, but I think emotional and social distress, again, plays a big part in our immune system, which again has been a contributing factor to these episodes. And I think another thing too, my first bout of infection was when I was 24. And that's when I was, kind of a young professional. I was very much into the social scene, social drinker, and I was in the business and advertising. So I had to take my clients out for entertainment, right? And that was kind of part of the job. You go to happy hours. And I know now that alcohol is not great for your lymphatic system. So I think overindulgence in alcohol, and I wouldn't say I was anywhere near being an alcoholic. I mean, I was just, average social drinker on the weekends, casually. But I think doing that consistently, on top of just the stress of that age, those all contributed to an episode of infection.
Is there a medicine that you have to take, or when you have those, or is it just?
Yeah, it's I mean, when the bouts of infection happen, the first thing I have to do is I'm immediately going to the ER and being admitted to a hospital because you don't want to go septic. So immediately what they do typically is they'll put me on IV antibiotics, kind of like amoxicillin or vancomycin, just kind of some of the baseline catch-all antibiotics, and they'll do it, through an IV or orally. But it's always been IV for me, especially when I'm in the hospital. And within 24 to 48 hours, I'm undergoing surgery where the orthopedic doctor is just really cleaning out that joint. Not super major surgery, but I mean, when you have 7 of those, each of them, I'm having to learn how to walk again. I'm having to go through 8 weeks of PT, just regaining that, range of motion, rebuilding the muscle again in the calf muscle and in the quadricep. And it just feels like, when you make great strides in physical therapy and you're finally feeling healthy again, you have this sporadic episode of infection and you're, 2 steps forward, 20 steps back, and having to deal with that beyond the physical and the emotional, it does have this psychological impact on a patient when you think you're doing all of the right things in your life. And for me, like having this most recent episode in December was shocking to me because I was eating healthier. I was wearing my compression garments religiously, daytime, nighttime, because that's what I do professionally. I didn't want to feel like a hypocrite to my patients if I wasn't practicing what I preached. And I even had a very successful lymphedema surgery in July. So it's like, why did I get this infection again? And, it wasn't because of my lymphedema. I just have this other condition. So now I'm addressing that by means of this past surgery and this upcoming surgery in May. So that's kind of been my most recent journey. It's not super common, not super normal, but that's all I know.
Do you feel at this point, like numb to the experience? And I mean, not necessarily the pain, but like on the fact of knowing it's like become routine for you to where you're just like, okay, here's my arm again, give me the IV. And it's like almost like, the pinch doesn't feel anything anymore because you're so used to it.
Well, I will say this. It kind of reminds me, one of my favorite songs is from like an old kind of classic rock band, Pink Floyd. And the title of the song is called Comfortably Numb, which almost kind of sounds like contradictory because like, who would want to be comfortably numb? That just means like you're okay with not feeling anything.
Yeah.
And for me, as a person who is very expressive with my feelings and emotions, I like feeling things. Sometimes I don't want to say I enjoy the pain, but the pain is something that I know is temporary and is, again, kind of that thing that I know if I conquer that pain, there's glory on the other side of that. It makes me stronger, and I don't want to say cliches, oh, that doesn't kill you, makes you stronger. But I mean, I think there is a lot of truth to that. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, have I become numb to all of this? It's kind of twofold. I think there's parts of it that are advantageous because I kind of know what to expect. So like from a recovery perspective, like me and my parents almost kind of have this second language when they're helping me transport in and out of the vehicle, or when I'm having to like bathe and shower myself, but they have to help me physically get into the shower and position my leg a certain way because there's certain, non-weight bearing. So I definitely feel like, in Texas, we say, this ain't my first rodeo, but because I've been through this so many times, it's somewhat soothing knowing what to expect. But then on the other side of the token, it's like, okay, well, I know this is going to be, crappy or insert explicit. I know this is going to be god awful. So knowing that that's coming can also kind of have a negative impact because I have those moments like, oh gosh, like I know this pain's going to suck. It's going to be really bad. So I have those moments where I kind of spiral. But again, I think when I can then recenter myself and now my headspace is, yes, acknowledge the pain. It's real. It's okay to have moments of doubt, but like know that God has your back in my situation. Right. I have an incredible family, incredible friends, and I will know that when I look back from this a year from now, 5 years from now, that it will have continued to shape me as a growing man and to make me more empathetic and sympathetic to my patients and just to other people in general. Like one of my pastor this past Sunday, gave a whole sermon about forgiveness. And, he talked about like even Jesus forgiving the Roman soldiers who crucified him. He said in one of his final breaths, forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they're doing. And I have to have that headspace when it comes to physicians who have misdiagnosed myself, misdiagnosed other patients. They don't know what they don't know. So I can't be bitter or angry towards them. I can't be bitter or angry towards my ex-girlfriends who couldn't handle being a caretaker. They just didn't know the struggles that I was going through. They didn't know that it would require this kind of help. So again, I think what it all comes down to, I said this earlier in the conversation, and this is one thing I want to echo to all of the patients out there listening who may have lymphedema or any other condition, is, give yourself some grace. Push at it as hard as you can, but give yourself that pat on the back. Celebrate small victories. Like for me, it's like, okay, today a small victory. I was able to sit in my wheelchair for over 4 hours when I trained my new assistant, whereas before I'd only was able to tolerate the wheelchair for like an hour, right? That's a big win for me, right? To the average person, I think, oh, big deal. But like to me, it's relative to me. It's my body. It's my journey. It's my temple. It's my experience. And I want to push it, but I also want to give it some grace. And, at this point, let it relax, let it recover. And so again, I just encourage any patient, regardless what you're going through, work hard, but still, allow yourself those times to feel the pain, because it is real, but know that you can get through it.
Well, I want to say thank you for your time and just taking this interview. I definitely will post it for the kids to see, for the world to see, and just so they can. And I just want to, before we go, I just want to sort of self-proclaim you as an elephant. And what I mean by you being an elephant is not only are you big and bold in your presence, but your spirit and your ability to really discern, to really hear the truth, and most important, to feel the truth that's in you. And your lead is such a charge. And I think that as you continue to go on your path, people will make room for you, because you're coming. You're basically the elephant in the room, and people are going to see you, feel you, hear you. And I just want to say thank you for being on the show, and it's such a joy.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Happy to come back anytime. And thank you for what you're doing. You have a platform, and being able to reach, I say if I change one patient's life, like that's already paid itself tenfold. And now that I have the ability to make that my career, my purpose, my passion and profession, like that's where God has intended me to be. So I thank you. And I'll close with this. This is one of my favorite quotes that one of my mentors told me a couple years ago. She said that the purpose of life is discovering your gift, but the meaning of life is giving that gift away to others. So that's what I want to continue to do. And you have a gift yourself, and I encourage you to share that and give that away to others. And happy to be here, and happy to be back anytime you'd have me.
Thank you.